Happy African History Month. Welcome to day 22. It is February 22nd, 2018. And today, as promised, I am talking about Martin versus Malcolm. That is the topic, and specifically Martin Luther King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance and harmony, those themes, versus Malcolm X's philosophy of meeting violence and violent oppression with violence, self-defense. So let's get into it. Which do you think is the better philosophy? Which do you think is the more moral philosophy? Which do you think is the more efficient philosophy, the more effective philosophy? A lot of times when I ask people, okay, specifically, I will hear mainstream black people and white people will say, no doubt, Martin Luther King's philosophy was better. They feel that meeting hatred with love is much more desirable. It's much is the right thing to do. Learning to soften your enemy's heart by putting love out to them, despite the fact that they are displaying hatred towards you. They also, the contrast between Martin and Malcolm, they think that Malcolm's rhetoric was, divisive and counterproductive. They feel that that militant stance isn't good, isn't positive, and I've heard so many people, make these comparisons. In fact, I can remember Tommy Lahren talking about, and this was in response to the Super Bowl, Beyonce's halftime show, how instead of honoring Malcolm X, she should have been honoring somebody like Martin Luther King Jr., who's a much better role model. Just recently, and in response to the Black Panther movie, Ben Shapiro has said, he sees the themes of the movie as being Martin versus Malcolm, and Martin wins. So he's like, that's a good thing. And there's some people who say that those individuals don't necessarily want to look at those two particular individuals, and I get their reasoning. But there's other people that honor Martin versus Malcolm. Think about who has their own day. Martin Luther King Jr. does. And these speeches that he's given, the I Have a Dream speech, of everyone living together peacefully, is a philosophy that's that's embraced by let's say mainstream America much more. But the question is, do people think it's truly the more moral position, or do they or the more effective position, or do they merely think it's the more moral and effective solution for black people? That's the key distinction. And I say that because when have any of these people that are espousing Martin Luther King Jr. as the more noble, more moral, more and his philosophies as the better role model, when have they ever espoused such philosophies for themselves? So obviously so this would mean, just let's look in recent history. September 12th, 2011. How many people were espousing Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy of loving your enemy, of turning the other cheek, of trying to understand your enemy, of not reacting in hatred and violence, thereby beginning more hatred and violence. How many people were espousing that philosophy? It's interesting because Boondocks actually did an episode about that, where after September 11th, Martin Luther King Jr., it hypothesizes if he had actually survived, and he's present after September 11th happens, and he goes on talk shows and tells people, we can't be so quick to rush to anger and to rush to war, and they call him all sorts of traitor, terrorist loving, commie scum. But think about it. When have these philosophies been advocated for mainstream America, for white America? When have these ideas been advocated as beneficial for anybody other than, black people? Just take a look at in popular mythos. You take a look at the comic books. X-Men. Professor Xavier represents Martin. Magneto represents Malcolm. Malcolm, is the bad guy, is the villain. Except if you take a look at the movies, in the first movie, he's clearly, that's the Martin and Malcolm, the mutants are a metaphor for black people, complete with Malcolm's line at the end of the movie of, I intend to win this war by any means necessary. But in the second movie, the mutants are used as a metaphor for homosexuals. As seen in the scene where Iceman comes out to his family. And they say, well, can't you stop being a mutant? So it's interesting that in the second movie, mutants are a metaphor for homosexuals. And notice in that movie, Magneto isn't the bad guy. Magneto and Professor X are working together. So when it comes to black people, the popular, the party line is be more like Martin. When it comes to anybody else, I'm not hearing anybody advocate Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy as beneficial. Let's take the two people I mentioned at the outset. Tommy Lahren. How many pictures, I've posted pictures of her on Facebook holding guns. I remember one of her early rants that made her famous, how Obama wasn't killing enough people in the Middle East, that he needed to bomb it into, the Stone Age, to show them America's might. It doesn't sound very Martin Luther King to me. But this is habitual. Ask Ben Shapiro the same thing. Is he advocating for the U.S. military to take that stance in the face of foreign aggressors to say, hey, let's not go to war. Let's try to understand why they are angry and upset at us. Let's try to understand what they're going through. No, that's not at all what he's advocating for. It's not at all what the vast majority of people are advocating for anybody other than black people. But why is Malcolm being villainized? Malcolm has been villainized because of who he was talking about defending himself against. Malcolm says, if this society, if the United States, if these people are oppressing us, are violently aggressing against us, are taking up arms against us, it is logical for us to defend ourselves. It is natural for us to defend ourselves. It is wise for us to defend ourselves. And And if you take away black people out of the equation and you just put that component of defending yourself, I don't think, I say 95% of the people who talk about it will say, oh, defend yourselves. There are a percentage of people who will across the board say, let's respond with love and let's not, react violently. But they're not really in mainstream America. They're not in your, they're definitely not in the military. They're not in public positions, politicians who are advocating any of these philosophies. They're, where are they? Because the only time I see people advocating for philosophy of letting yourself get beaten and just taking the beating, trying to understand your enemy and win them over with love, is when it's in respect to black people catching hell as a result of white supremacy. And that's why it's clear to me that if people don't want to do this for themselves, people won't advocate this position for themselves, it is not an intelligent choice for me to advocate on my behalf, on my people's behalf, on other black people's behalf, because who's using this? Who's using this to an effect? Question was it even used effectively in Martin's case? Let's not get it twisted. As I said in my previous video about Martin Luther King Jr., there's one thing you cannot call him is a coward, because he stood on the front lines, putting himself at risk, putting his body in harm's way to advocate this philosophy. But that doesn't mean it worked. You can say, okay, well, look, the Civil Rights Act. And then let's take a look at the Civil Rights Act. It was an act that was used to, one, expand government power, and two, provide redress for minorities. Not black people, for minorities. And I have to even use quotes for that, because I believe women outnumber men in the United States, but yet they are still considered a minority. So take a look at who has benefited from these laws that were passed. From affirmative action to, affirmative action, white women have been one of the prime recipients and beneficiaries of affirmative action. So now, what did Martin Luther King Jr. accomplish on behalf of black people? He got the powers that be to make their war less overt. So yeah, they had to go undercover with it, because he did manage to paint them as villains. That was what was accomplished. So by him not swinging back, by him just taking beatings, by him and his followers, being beaten, being lynched, being, just brutalized, that image made it clear those images made it clear who the bad guy was. But in all reality, there shouldn't have been any question. There shouldn't have been any question who the bad guy was. And even if there was, that doesn't change the fact that people were being murdered, people were being, lynched, raped, oppressed, just horribly facing all sorts of atrocities, that it was that we're actually duty bound to try to stop if we are able to. It's one of the first rules of nature is self-preservation. But even a higher calling is, if you see somebody else being wrong, to step in and try to stop it. So on those grounds alone, I think it was incumbent, and I think it remained incumbent upon us to stand up when we see such types of atrocities being committed, because all it takes for evil to flourish is for good men to do nothing. And unfortunately, I'm of the mind that sitting in, singing in, holding hands is not an immediate and it's not an immediate enough response to stop an atrocity, to save lives. And hey, responding in violence can actually, there is a downside. There is a downside. Responding in violence to a force that is, more military, that has more military capabilities, has its own risk. But at that point, it's about making things harder for the people that are committing these acts, making them feel some type of pain, making there be some type of cost, so maybe they will stop and mitigate their actions. Maybe they will draw back and say, okay, this is more trouble than it's worth. We can win, but there will be a significant cost to us as well. We will suffer harm as well. And I think that is part of Malcolm's core philosophy of, hey, you may win, but I'm going to give you hell until you do. And hey, Malcolm spoke about responding sensibly. Malcolm didn't advocate just going around and attacking people who aren't attacking you. Malcolm spoke about self-defense. That's logical. That's rational. Yet there is still continues to be this demonization of his philosophy when it comes to black people. But I'm going to leave this video here. I'm going to ask the question to you. Who do you feel? Which philosophy do you feel was more beneficial? If you have quotes, speeches, things like that you want to include, by all means, feel free. I want to hear from what other people think, and I will reserve further discussion of this in a later episode, because I want to know, when has this ever been discussed or advocated for somebody other than black people in the United States, or even black people in other countries? And if so, has it been used? Has it been well, of course, I know Gandhi managed to achieve a great deal, but okay, tell me, when has white America ever used this? Has this ever been successful? When has this been successful? So these are the kind of questions I'm asking. I want some answers for. I want to know your opinions and your viewpoints. And I can discuss it further in a later episode. So thank you for joining me today. Once again, happy African History Month, and I will see you tomorrow.